API strategy.
Is it API strategy or
I would say
API strategy?
API strategy for decision
Decision.
API strategy for decision makers.
Hey, Mike Amundsen here, and I'm with Derric Gilling. We're talking about API strategy for decision makers. Derric and I worked on an O'Reilly report that was recently released, and we thought we would bring this to some videos and talk a little bit more about it. I've known Derric for a couple of years through his company, Moesif, and it was a real pleasure to work with Derric on this project. And Derric, I just want to say hi to you. How you doing?
Doing great. Thanks for having me here, Mike. Just quick intro on myself. I'm the CEO of Moesif, and we're the leading API analytics and monetization platform. And so we love talking about, API strategy and really anything around how to treat your APIs as products.
Yeah, and that's actually how you and I met up. I think I did a podcast with you and Larry, and it was really this notion of products. I think productization or product thinking is really, really important at this stage for API developers. And I really enjoyed the kinds of things we got to talk about in the report. But sort of more to the point, why is it products are important now? What's changed? What's different? And why is it important that everybody sort of think about their APIs, even their internal APIs, as a product?
Well, Mike, I mean, the way that we're treating APIs is drastically different today than it was 10 years ago. If you think even in 2015, I think Twilio was valued around $500 million, and look at it as where it is now. The way that we're selling software is fundamentally different. 10 years ago, you might have an enterprise sales team, and they're going to do sales demos, pitch decks, and actually sign on the dotted line before anyone is ever using the product. These days, a lot of times, by the time that sales is getting engaged, you already have developers using the API. They might be testing it in like a sandbox or some type of local environment, and so it's a much later engagement process, and at that time it's mostly like an upsell, right? And so how do you make sure you can actually cover the rest of that journey before sales is engaged?
Yeah, I think that's a really important element that we talked about in the report, and that I've seen you talk about on articles on your website as well. And that is this idea that it's a very different kind of cycle. It's a very different kind of selling experience now that we're dealing with APIs. Often it's developers that are driving the bus. It's developers that make it happen in one form or another. And I think the other thing that's really interesting is you at Moesif have developed a really clear cycle, sort of a product life cycle. Every product has a life cycle of something, but they're unique for APIs. And I think there are lots of things that we need to cover, right, when we think about a product life cycle for APIs.
Indeed. And so in the book itself, we talk about 5 different steps, around that API strategy. You start off with discovery and adoption, and then you move into the monetization part. And of course, that includes pricing and packaging. But last but not least is how do you actually handle deprecating an API? What does that end of life cycle look like when we start treating these as products? Just touching on the first two, discovery and adoption, one of the biggest differences today is that developers have a lot more autonomy, and they're actually involved in that decision-making process. They get to pick and choose, which APIs, which tools they want to use. And that means by the time that, again, sales is getting engaged, they're actually leaning on these developers, who has already been playing with the API, and they're actually excited to bring this up to their manager to say, hey, this is what I built. I think this could be important at the organization. And so when we think about adoption, that means it's really important for these API first companies to actually pull developers into their ecosystem, whether that's through inbound marketing, through partner channels, through really anything that you're doing around the marketing side should be pulling people into your ecosystem versus trying to push the product onto developers. It's the worst thing you could do is a developer, sees these random emails about a salesperson trying to push that product, and they're not even excited yet. They're not going to champion or even spend the time to look at this API if they're not excited.
Yeah, I think that was a real learning moment when I got that from you. This notion of pull rather than push. And I think it really explains the rise of developer evangelists in the API space as well, because that's one of the key ways that you can really pull developers onto your platform or into your product world, by showing them what's possible and evangelizing the notion of solving problems. So I think that's a really, really interesting way to think about it. I agree with your view on adoption too. You're trying to get to that aha moment, right? That time when developers get that passion, get excited about something. I think Twilio knows this really well, because I remember years ago, Twilio had a campaign to decision makers, which basically said, talk to your developers, right? So it's really keying right into that notion about how important developers are in this life cycle. And I think you talk about that in another aspect as well, and that is this sort of idea of monetization, right? So when you talk about monetizing, you talk about landing developers first. What's that about?
Sure. And so when we talk about, this activation or adoption process, there's two key metrics we like to speak on. The first is time to first hello world, and the second is time to first working app. And it's really important, especially when we look at the first metric, that encompasses your entire developer experience, and it can be a North Star metric for the entire product team or even the company when we think about building out a great developer experience. What time to first hello world is the time it takes a developer to sign up and make that very first API call, whether that's through a tool like Postman or curl command or something like that. They're at least investing enough time to test out the API. Now, the tricky thing with time to first hello world is they haven't actually received any value yet, other than just a very, very little taste of what the API could do. And that's where we get to this next notion of time to first working app. Some people might call this time to a revenue app or revenue generating app. And what that means is a developer got to that aha moment, which might mean sending over text messages, 100 text messages if it's a telecommunications API. It might mean a number of transactions sent through the API. And that's what we really mean by time to first working app.
All right, Derric, you're so right. We've really covered a lot here in this episode, talking about adoption, discovery, the time to first hello, the actual working strategic application, and there's so much more. Now I've got lots of questions about pricing and planning your modifications and eventually your deprecation of the old APIs, but we've kind of run out of time here. So let's put a pin in this, and then we'll cover those details in our next episode of API strategy for decision makers.